that. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm David Rose with U.S. Expansion Partners. Let me share my screen out, and we'll talk about what we're going to be doing today. All right. So as Aaron mentioned, my firm helps companies come to the U.S. and launch here. And during that process, there's typically the same set of questions that we see continuously. And what we wanted to do today is kind of give you an overview of what those questions look like, so you can start thinking about topics as you're ready to go and come to the U.S. And so these are the topics: entity formation, accounting, banking, site selection, human resources, visa, taxes, insurance, employees, go-to-market, and intellectual property, and then raising venture capital. So we're going to go through these topics. We're fortunate to have some subject matter experts on the panel today. We'll be taking a deep dive into visas and also intellectual property. So we're going to go through this deck, and then we're going to have a fireside chat with some subject matter experts to take us further into those topics. I'm going to be happy to share this deck afterwards. And so if you'd like a copy of the deck, at the end, we're going to share everyone's contact information. Feel free to shoot me an email, and I'll be happy to send the deck out to you. So let's go ahead and get started. The first step when you're coming to the US and creating an entity here is to form an entity. And there's lots of different options on the entities types in the US. And so there's a lot of variables into thinking about what's the best type for you. And there's professionals, whether it be attorneys or other companies, who can help you decide what's the best for you. So there's different types. You'll hear limited partner or limited liability corporations, S corporations, and C corporations. The most common, especially if you have outside investors or you look to raise venture capital in the US, will be forming a C corporation. And the most common place to form a C corporation in the United States is the state of Delaware. And there's a bunch of reasons by that. So you're actually going to incorporate in a specific state. And so there's 50 choices of places to do that. A lot of the business community in the US is kind of focused on Delaware. It's a unique and uniform set of rules that everyone's very comfortable with. So that's kind of the default standard in the US, is creating a Delaware C corporation. Now, one of the questions that come up immediately is, well, if we form a Delaware C corporation, do we have to have our company in Delaware? And the answer is no. You can form a Delaware C corporation in the United States and have your company located or domiciled really anywhere in the US. So, for example, I've been the CEO of 3 Delaware C corporations, but I've personally never even been to Delaware. So it's really not a limiter as far as where you create your company location. We'll talk more about site selection in a few minutes. But in addition to, or part of the incorporation process, you're going to need to create articles of incorporation. You're going to have named bylaws and officers. One question that comes up: do you need to have U.S. citizens as your bylaws and officers? And the answer is no, you do not. You also want to have you'll also create what's called a federal identification number. So this is with the federal government or the IRS. And then you're going to pick a state where you're going to domicile, where your office is typically located. So when you pick that state, you're also going to typically have to set up a state tax withholdings number within that state, and a state unemployment number for that. So essentially, it's the incorporation, the federal identification number, and the state identification numbers. At that point, you've created an entity, and you can start moving forward with the other steps of the launch process in the US. So a pretty common next step is the accounting process itself. So you're going to have to actually run a separate accounting system in the US. So this will be a subsidiary typically when you run this. So it simply runs as a separate company. So as part of the accounting operations to set up, you're going to have accounting software, probably like where you use in your home country. The most popular accounting softwares here in the US are QuickBooks or Xero. And through that, you'll do accounts payables and receivables, much like you would 1099 administration, which is for contractors, your bank reconciliation. And you also produce monthly and annual financial reports for your US corporation. Also, part of the accounting process here in the US is you'll want to engage what's called a certified public accounting firm or CPA firm. They're going to help with a couple very specific tasks that are important. They're going to help you create and file your federal tax return. So here in the US, you'll have a federal tax return with the US government and the IRS, and you're going to have a state tax return. And the state tax return could be where you are domiciled. It could be where you have employees. There's several variables, but you're going to have at least one state and one federal return. And this is something the CPA firm will do for you. Another function of the CPA firm is to do what's called transfer pricing determination. So when you have a subsidiary, you have to have a third party come in and determine what is the appropriate essential pricing share between the two companies. So you'll essentially set up your US subsidiary as a distributor in the US, and you'll pass the distributor will pay a fee for access, for example, for software from the parent company or support. And again, the CPA firm is the best person or best people typically to come in and do this pricing determination for you. And you're also going to have tax considerations. So tax implications for how you run the business in both the US and your parent company. And so these are the items or the areas where the CPA firms really add a lot of value and can help. The next thing you'll want to do is create a US bank. So in the US, the banking system uses what's called the Automated Clearinghouse System, or ACH system, to transfer money. And it doesn't work very well with the international SWIFT system. And so it's a separate banking network altogether. So to do business in the US, you're going to need a US bank account. And to pay bills, to pay employees, to receive funding from clients, for example. It's a little bit more challenging than you might think to open a bank in the US. And so there are what's called KYC, or know your customer, rules that the banking system in the US must follow. And essentially they're anti-money laundering, anti-terrorist provisions that don't allow banks to bank people they don't actually know. And so one of the challenges when you come to the US is you would think you could just simply call someone like, a big US bank like Morgan Stanley or Citibank or Bank of America, and you want to do business with them. It's a pretty high hurdle for them to want to do business. So one of the challenges is trying to find a bank that will actually take your business. And so some banks internationally will actually be able to open a US account. So it's kind of a shortcut. So for example, I know HSBC can open a US account from anywhere in the world. And that would kind of save you those challenges of going through the KYC or know your customer program. To open a bank in the US, there's a few requirements. So you're gonna need a physical address that can be verified. You're also gonna need, we talked about earlier, the Federal Employer Identification Number, or FEIN. And you're also going to need to bring in your articles of incorporation from the state, so example, Delaware, and you're going to have named officers. So typically when you have your articles of incorporation and your named officers, there's going to be rules around who is allowed to open a bank account, and you'll need to bring the documentation with you. So banking in the US is different. You're going to need a US bank account, and there's a few items you're going to need to actually be able to open that, in addition to finding a bank who will actually bank you. But there are plenty of regional banks who will take on international clients. So now that you have incorporation and your accounting set up and some banking, site selection is a big topic. And so one of the things that's grown in popularity is there are virtual offices. So you can actually go and sign up for an office address. The challenge with that is that when you go through due diligence with banking or insurance, they're probably going to want to go look at the actual office to make sure it's legitimate. And so some of the virtual office locations don't have great looking local offices. We have a client who has a virtual office in Miami. I use this service to look for a virtual office where I'm based in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. That address turned out to be a BP gas station. Definitely not something you would want an underwriter at the insurance companies or the banking companies to see. And so what we typically recommend is actually getting some kind of physical office location that looks legitimate. And it could be a WeWork or co-working space so it might cost a few $100s more than a virtual office, but it's going to give you all the underwriting credentials you're going to need with banking and insurance, for example. So if you decide, physical office versus a virtual office, we'd recommend even a small physical office address for those reasons. One site selection criteria a lot of people don't think about is operating hours overlay with the parent company. And so, for example, if you are coming from Europe or the UK to the US, you'd probably want to consider setting up an office on the East Coast of the US, because you're going to have 4 to 5 hours of operating overlay with the parent company. What happens is if your parent company is in London and the US office is in California, you only have about an hour of operating overlay. And so it really doesn't allow you to move at the speed of business, because if you have a question you need answered around product or finance or support or sales, and you have to get answered from the home office, if you only have 1 hour of operating overlap, you really can't move at the speed of business. You have to wait a day essentially to get any questions answered. And so depending on where you're located, if you're coming from Asia, probably being on the West Coast of the US and California makes more sense. If you're located in Europe, being on the East Coast. So those operating hour overlays are super important just from a ability to execute and move at the speed of business here in the US. Another site selection criteria people coming to the US for the first time don't realize, and we're going to talk about taxes a little bit more here in a minute, but in the US, you're going to have a federal income tax, and you're also going to pay state income tax. And the income tax rates vary greatly by state. And so depending on where you domicile your company, you're going to pay a different tax rate by state. And so where you set up your office, you could be in a very high tax location or a very low tax location. That makes a material difference in profitability. So that you'll want to look at the state tax rates as part of your selection criteria. Access to talent. So you want to make sure if you're in a specific industry that you have access to talent that you can hire, and you'd want to make sure you have a talent pool in the geography that you're going to be considering to where you put your location. Another consideration is proximity to customers and partners. Being closer is sometimes better, although it's much trickier now in the days of remote work. I had a client who wanted to set their operations in Arizona because it was close to a big partner of theirs, but it turned out their partner manager worked remotely in a different state altogether, so they were rarely in Arizona. So that's one consideration, is proximity to customers and partners, but it gets tricky a little bit when you have people doing remote work. Another cost consideration, of course, is the cost of living for the employees. Some states, as you can imagine, have much higher cost of living than others. And so it's not only cost of living for the individuals, but also cost of operations for the company itself. And then lastly, another important part is ease of travel. If you haven't done business in the US before, it's hard to comprehend just how large the country is. And so you want to make sure you're near an airport where you can have direct flights. So there are large airports you can fly directly to probably any city in the country. And there are smaller regional airports where you have to take a second hop to get to a bigger airport before you can get to your final destination. So it's more time consuming and ultimately more expensive. And you might also want to consider, in addition to air travel, the ability to drive to customers and partners without having to get on a plane at all. So anyway, those are the site selection criteria to consider, and we talk people through. And the next topic is, once you come into the US, we're going to have to get some insurances. And so you've probably heard the US is a litigious country, and that certainly can be the case. And so you're going to make sure you have appropriate insurance coverages. So the first insurance coverage, it's going to be mandatory. Everyone's going to require this, whether it be to rent an office or to open a bank account or anything else. It's typically going to be general liability insurance. And that's just your basic liability insurance for your operations in the US. It's not super expensive. Once you have employees in the US, another statutory insurance is workers' compensation. And this is insurance that you pay to a private insurance company. And should you have an employee injury, that person will be compensated while they're out of work or recovering. So both those are statutory, so required by law to have both of those. Additional coverages you either may want to consider, or you may be required to have through customers and partners, especially if you're in technology, would be errors and omissions or cyber and privacy. Those protect you from insurance should you be sued over problems with your technology products. Another coverage that we highly recommend is directors and officers. So typically when there is litigation in the US, the corporate entity will be sued, but it's also very common for the officers or directors of the corporation to also be sued. So this would be a policy to provide insurance to help offset legal fees should there be litigation directly against directors or officers of the corporation. From a employment or HR standpoint, common coverage is employment practices. So again, if you have someone who sues you for illegal termination or discrimination or whatever it may be, this would be insurance to help offset some of those liabilities. And then here in the US, the US government only provides health insurance for people who live below the poverty level, essentially. So it's very common in the US for the employers to provide health insurance for the employees. It's quite expensive, but it's a pretty common practice. And so if you're wanting to attract, good talent to come work for your company in the U.S., adding health insurance is going to be probably something you're going to have to consider and almost certainly offer to employees at some point. So that's an overview of the insurances, a lot of details there, but want to provide you some ideas of some of the high level talking points on that front. So in the U.S., there's lots of taxes. As I mentioned earlier, there's both federal and state taxes. So in the U.S., for the federal side, there's going to be a tax on corporate profits or corporate income. There's also a federal tax called the FICA tax that both the employer and employee pay. And there's also a federal unemployment tax. So these are all taxes you're going to have from the federal government. And then when you go to the individual states, and these are going to vary pretty significantly, you're going to have a myriad of taxes within the states themselves. So as mentioned earlier, most states also have an income tax. They're going to be an unemployment tax. Sales tax not only varies by state, but also vary by industry and even region within that. Sales tax in the U.S. is very complex. A business property tax, so your assets are going to be taxed typically by the states. And in the case of you create a Delaware C corporation, but you have your company domiciled in Atlanta, Georgia, the state of Delaware will charge you a franchise tax. So there's just some ideas of the different taxes for the federal and state government. And if you operate in multiple states, for example, you have employees or customers or operations in multiple states, all those state taxes are going to be multiplied times the number of states that you're in. So again, pretty complex. There are obviously a lot of people who can help with those type of things, but just be prepared for a lot of companies when they first come to the U.S. are used to dealing with one tax authority. In the U.S., you have the federal tax authority, but you also have individual authorities from each state to reckon with. So when you're coming to the U.S., if you want to send someone from your parent company into the U.S., you're going to have to deal with immigration and visas in the U.S. This is a pretty complex topic. Fortunately, we have a subject matter expert, Heidi Son, is going to talk us through some of the details around the different types of visas and which ones make the most sense for different scenarios. So I'm not going to spend much time on this because we have someone who knows a lot more about it than I do coming up to talk to us about this in just a few moments. So in the U.S., human resources, again, you're going to have a employee base in the U.S. These are all things that are very important to, again, not only attracting talented employees to come work for your company, but managing those people and also being in compliance with the different state and federal tax regulations, not tax regulations, but human resources regulations. So typically in HR, human resources, you're going to have, that's where the payroll is going to be. You have employee benefits like the healthcare benefits, for example. An employee stock option program would be administered typically through human resources. And you also have human resources is more and more often focused on things like talent and culture within the company itself, not just the employee benefits. Compliance not only with federal rules, which there are many, but also the rules within individual states vary significantly. So the compliance is a big part of it. And a lot of this will be managed through technology. So employees will have typically portals so they can go and self-administer these type of things or track their vacation time. So there's a pretty large technology component to this. When you're first getting started in the US, there are companies or services called a PEO, a professional employee organization. And they essentially take on all these functions on behalf of your company. So your choices are, when you're first starting out in the U.S., is going out and getting solutions for each one of these things individually. Using a PEO will allow you to basically have a one-stop place to get all these services in one place. As you grow into a larger company, it'll probably become more cost-effective to do it yourself. But as you're getting started, it's typically more cost-effective and easier to start using a service provider.
Excuse me, David?
Yes?
What is compliance, please?
Yeah, so compliance would be adherence to the rules, either federal or state rules around human resources, and this could be rules around hiring or firing employees. It could be rules around discrimination. It could be rules around benefits, and so compliance would be rules and making sure you're following all the rules with the federal and state governments. So I want to dig in just a little bit more on some of the employee costs. So when you start thinking about coming to the US, you start wanting to do a budget, and the biggest part of that budget is typically your employee costs. So I want to take a quick look at some of those costs to consider when you're trying to do a budget. So the compulsory cost we talked a little bit about earlier from the federal government would be the federal unemployment tax. That's 6% of wages up to a certain threshold, $8,000, I believe, in the US. But there's also a state unemployment tax. And again, this varies not only by the rate, but also the amount or cap by state. So most states will have a certain percent of wages up to the maximum amount. There's also the federal contribution or FICA tax, which again is a federal tax. It's 7.65% of wages. Both the employer and the employee pay this tax in the US. And then also we talked a little bit about it earlier, the workers' compensation is a compulsory cost. And this is going to vary not only by state, but also by the individual job. So for example, if you have people who are in manufacturing or construction, their rate for workers' compensation is going to be much higher than you have someone who's in a clerical job or in sales. So those are some of the compulsory costs to consider when doing a budget. Some of the additional costs we talked about earlier would be health insurance. I'm a 401k, which is an employer-sponsored retirement plan here in the U.S. Again, this is pretty common to be provided by the corporation itself. And then, especially in tech, there's an expectation for a lot of employees that there's going to be an employee stock option program. So these would be a cost, over and above salaries that you're going to need to consider when you look at what your cost to operate in the U.S. and when you do your budget. Another question. So, once you have employees, it's like, gosh, we need to go make some sales in the U.S. and generate some revenue. That's the point of coming in most cases. And so some of the go-to-market things you're going to want to consider about coming to the U.S. is, I guess the first one I would say is a mistake a lot of companies make is if they assume that they have product market fit in their home office or their home country, that they're going to have product market fit in the U.S. And that's repeatedly not the case. And so people make that assumption, and you have to come and make sure that what your expectations are around how the pricing is and the feature set and the competitors, these are all things you're going to have to kind of reevaluate from scratch when you come to the US market. So making sure you have product market fit before you put a whole bunch of resources and money behind the expansion and rollout. And this also includes branding and positioning, like how does your company fit in the market here in the US, and how is your brand position? Your pricing strategy, not only the amount, but the type of pricing you have. Are you going to have strategic partners here in the US who are going to help you go to market faster, resellers, your distributors, or other partners in the ecosystem or value chain of your specific industry? Your sales approach, are you going to be a top-down enterprise sales where you go talk to your customer's CEO and try and sell them, or CFO? Or are you going to be a bottom-up product-led growth business? So trying to decide what is your sales approach, because that's going to make a big difference in how you hire in the US. And also demand generation. So I think a common mistake people make is they think, oh, we're just going to hire a salesperson in the US and they're going to go make a bunch of sales for us. But you really have to, look, doing business in the US is super competitive. Even if you have a great product, it's pretty difficult. So you're going to have to do some demand generation or marketing to create awareness for your product and drive demand so people want to talk to your salespeople and learn more about your product itself. And one thing on the sales approach I hear often is I've had many people reach out to me and say, oh, we're just going to hire a commission-only salesperson to represent our product here in the US initially. And what I would say, I think most of my background is in technology. But one thing I always caution people around is if you have, for example, if you're in the software, enterprise software, and you want to hire someone in the US, if someone in the US has enterprise sales experience and knowledge and contacts, they can demand a really high salary. And so my caution will be anyone who would be willing to work for your company on a commission-only basis probably can't get a job anywhere else if they have the skill set that you need. So just be very wary of a commission-only salesperson. They rarely work out. And then finally, when comes time to do go-to-market in the US and you want to close sales, you're going to want your contracts and agreements converted to the U.S. system. So those customers oftentimes feel much more comfortable doing business with a U.S. entity than an entity from overseas. So once you create the corporation, you're going to want to create U.S. contracts or U.S. version of those contracts and agreements that you're going to use with your customers. So another topic that's very important you're going to want to pay particular attention to is intellectual property in the U.S. And so you may have patents or trademarks in your home country, but you're going to want to make sure and protect your intellectual property here in the U.S. as well. So I'm not going to spend a bunch of time on this topic. We also have a subject matter expert who's going to be joining us here in just a minute on this topic. David Rocio, who's going to be talking to us about IP here in the U.S. There are some specific differences, and we're going to get into some of those here in just a few minutes. So one more topic, oftentimes companies, when they come to the US, are interested in raising venture capital here in the US market. And there's some important things to know. So one of the things that's a lot of people don't realize is that there are literally thousands and thousands of venture capital firms here in the US. So what I've found personally over the years is there's kind of three important steps to being successful in this market. And the first one is to target the right venture capital firm. So a lot of venture capital firms will have very specific investment thesis that they focus on. So for example, if I'm a venture capital firm, I might have a investment thesis around e-commerce, men's fashion, seed stage companies. And so what you want to do is you want to find and target the firms who have an investment thesis that aligns with your company. So it sounds really simple, but you want to basically find there are so many investment firms in the US, there's almost certainly one that's going to be interested in what you're doing, but you just have to find the right one. So targeting the right firm and targeting the right partner within the firm, and then getting personal introductions are a really important part of the process in raising venture capital in the US. You can spend a lot of time chasing the wrong firms that get you really nowhere. From a valuation perspective, there's a lot of talk around, as you start raising money, about what's your pre-money valuation, what's your post-money valuations. And what I found over the years is professional investors think more in terms of equity versus valuation. What I mean by that is most professional venture investors, when they do a round of funding, are going to want to take a 20% equity stake in your company. And if you're taking a 20% equity stake, the pre-money and post-money valuation of your company is kind of a plug or a math equation. So for example, if you're raising $5 million and you're going to be diluted by 20%, that means your pre-money valuation is going to be $20 million and your post-money valuation is going to be $25 million. So it's, that's just one thing to keep in mind, is a lot of the professional investors, as you kind of get into seed or A or B stage round, are going to think more in terms of equity versus the valuation, and that would be the driver for the valuation itself. Another common kind of a cultural thing here in the US around the venture capital is they typically don't sign non-disclosure agreements. So I would encourage you not to ask. There's a lot of reasons why they don't do that. Is that right or wrong? I'm not here to say, but I think just kind of from a cultural standpoint in the industry is that professional investors don't sign non-disclosure agreements, so it's best not to ask. Another thing to keep in mind when you're raising venture capital in the US, I think there's a misperception that because there's so many venture capital firms in the US and there's so much press around the successful companies, that it's easy to raise venture capital in the US. And that's really far from the truth. I think a lot of companies think they can simply fly into San Francisco, rent a car, drive to Sand Hill Road in Palo Alto, and there'll be venture capital firms lined up to throw term sheets at you. And it really doesn't work that way. It's much more difficult. So an expectation, this is with companies here in the US, this is just for companies coming to the US, is you should expect to do 100 or more pitches before you get your first term sheet from a venture capital firm. So that's something to keep in mind. It's a lot of work and it takes a long time. So be sure you plan accordingly. Another thing that's expected with professional investors in the US is that the founders will revest 100% of their shares over a 4-year vesting period again. It's a pretty emotional topic for a lot of founders who may have been toiling away at their company for even 10 years or more, and investing hundreds of thousands of dollars of their own money into the company to get it to a certain point. But the venture capital firms will expect the founders to reinvest all their shares as part of the conditions of the term sheet. Another thing that's from a kind of a cultural standpoint and also a compliance standpoint is finders fees for introducing people to venture capital firms are largely frowned upon in the U.S. For two reasons. One is in the U.S. to take a commission on a fundraise, you need to be licensed, have a Series 6 or 7, and be a licensed dealer broker in the U.S. And so if someone's saying, hey, I can introduce you to a venture capital firm, but I'm going to need a percentage of that deal, you just want to make sure they have a broker dealer license. If they don't, it'd be a violation of U.S. Security and Exchange Commission rules. So always want to make sure that anyone you want to do that with is a licensed broker dealer. But more importantly, especially for the tier one investors, is they want all of their money. They want 100% of their money going into growth of your business. And they certainly don't want to see a percentage 2, 5, 10% of that investment going to some third party. So that's something to know. One question we get quite a bit is, will investors invest, or do I have to move my headquarters to the US to do venture capital with the US? And the answer is no. So, and you can kind of, when you start doing research on venture funds, a lot of them are very comfortable investing overseas. This also has to do with the stage of the company. Typically, the later stage the company is, the more comfortable the investors are going to be with having the company headquartered elsewhere. Some funds might want that, and then some funds might expect that, but that's not a requirement overall. So anyway, that's a top of our 12 items. What I want to do now is put up some contact information for myself and Heidi and Dave. And we're going to bring Heidi and Dave on next to kind of take a deeper dive into a couple topics. But here's our contact information, and I'll leave it up for just a few minutes if you want to jot it down. Again, if you want to copy this deck, please feel free just to send me an email, and I'll be happy to send the deck back to you right away. So what we want to do next is bring on Heidi San and Dave Rocchio, sorry, Dave. So Heidi is the head of business immigration at Murray Osorio. She's been practicing business immigration law for 10 different years across 5 different countries. So she basically helps people who are coming to the U.S. figure out all the complexities of the visa system. So Heidi's going to be walking us through some of the topics around specifically visas. And then Dave is an intellectual property attorney with Lando and Anastasia. They're based in Boston, and he has a lot of experience helping startups, especially foreign-based startups, launch their business here in the U.S. and deal with a lot of the questions we touched on earlier around intellectual property and trademarks. So these are 2 really important topics that we wanted to take some more time and dig into a little bit. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can just bring Heidi and Dave on here and get the discussion going a little bit. All right. So Heidi, let's start with you. Let me give you a really easy question to start. What's the best visa? I'm coming to the US. Which one do I need? Let's just cut right to it.
So it's not so easy because it all depends, right? I mean, it's a typical lawyer answer, and I'm sorry for that, but not all startups and entrepreneurs are in similar situations. So I think the first question is, do you already have an established company abroad, or are you starting from scratch in the US? You're starting a new business in the US. And also another question is the applicant who's coming to the US an owner of the company versus an employee or executive of the company? So those are the 2 questions that will, I guess, that will determine what type of visa might be the best for you.
And Heidi, I know there's multiple options for visas.
Mm-hmm.
What are the most common ones you see when people come into the U.S.? We'll try to narrow it down a little bit instead of just giving one answer. What are the more common ones you see when people are coming to the U.S. for the first time?
Right. So the most common ones for entrepreneur startups are E visas, E1, E2, and L visas. Those are the 2 most common. E visas are generally E2 are investment visa for certain treaty country nationals. So not all country nationals are eligible for it. So the US and your home country has to have a treaty. There's a list on Department of State website, and you can find if your country qualifies, for instance. You have to have invested a substantial amount of money into the US company, whether as an individual or as a foreign company, and that substantial amount has to be spent. It's not some money sitting in a bank, for instance. L1 visas is so for an e-visa, just to clarify, you don't have to have a foreign company yet. You could be starting completely from scratch in the US. For an L visa, you actually need an established company in abroad somewhere, and then you're starting a new company in the US. You don't have to have made any kind of substantial investment. So if money is tight, L might be the better option for you. The only caveat is for an L new business visa, it's only good for 1 year initially. It's to show the US that you're starting off the startup company, and that within a year that it will be operational and generating some type of revenue.
And how do you, what are the rules around it? So if I'm a foreign national, I want to start a business in the US and I want to come here on vacation, what are the rules around what I can do while I'm here touring the US on vacation from a business perspective?
Yes, you can vacation, but you cannot do any kind of gainful employment. So a lot of people nowadays post-COVID, they're like, well, I just actually had a consultation yesterday. Someone who came on a tourist visa, she was going to be applying for a student visa. She was checking out different campuses, and she was still working for her company employer in Peru. And she was, but I was working remotely. And I was like, but that doesn't matter. You were physically in the US. If you are physically in the US, I call it the butt test. If your butt is sitting in the US, then you cannot be working. It doesn't matter if your employer is abroad. It doesn't matter if your bank account is abroad and all the money transactions is happening abroad. As long as you're physically in the US, you have to have work authorization. But there are some activities that are allowed on a tourist visa, whether it's a B1, B2 or ESTA, visa waiver program. There are some business activities which are allowed. For example, business meetings with potential investors or potential clients where you're doing sales contract negotiations on behalf of a foreign entity. If you're traveling to attend a conference, a seminar, if you're doing like short-term training or doing market research, all of these things are considered business activity. So yes, there is sort of a gray line. What is business activity versus what is gainful employment? I always say if it is something that you would be doing in your normal course of work for your employer, you shouldn't be doing it in the US unless you have work authorization.
And one other question on the visa front, Heidi, before we jump over to IP a bit, what's the timing expectation? So once we say yes, we determine what the right visa is, how much time would we take before it's issued, and then what can I do in the interim during the process while we're waiting for the visa to be issued?
So sorry, again, it depends. It depends on where you are located because each US embassy abroad has different timing issues. So some embassies have not recovered from the COVID backlog, and there's a long waiting period versus some embassies have recovered very quickly. Also, if it's a visa like an L where you have to do a two-part process of applying at US CIS first and then getting an approval before you go to a US embassy. So that obviously will take longer because it's a two-part process. But you can pay extra called premium processing for USCIS services, and they will adjudicate it much faster in 15 days, or they will take forever, like a year. So I always suggest, yes, it's worthwhile to spend the extra $2,500. So in a best case scenario, you're looking at maybe 4 to 6 months before you can get a visa, depending on which category and where you're located. Worst case scenario, sometimes it could take a year. In the meantime, you could still do setup type of activities. For example, getting your company incorporated, finding the right accountant, getting your bank account set up for the company, doing some like finding the office, like you talked about. For immigration purposes, you need a physical office. You cannot have a virtual office. So, so all of those kind of setup activities you can do. You can even hire a US manager to get the company started and launched while you're waiting for your visa as well.
Great, thanks so much. So Dave, we're coming to the US. Do I really need to, I have a patent in my home country. Do I really need to get one in the US? Is that important?
Sure, great question, David. So, short answer, yes. So, all IP rights are territorial, right? So, for companies or people on this call, if you have IP rights or registrations in your home region or your home country, that's not going to get you anything directly in the United States. You need to take action in the United States. There are international treaties and laws that most of the industrialized world have signed on to help you affect filings, subsequent filings after you file in your home region. For example, if I file in Europe as my home region, and then I want to subsequently file in the United States before I enter the United States, there are treaties that allow you to file that application in the United States and do what we call claim priority back to your original filing in Europe. So that US filing will be treated as if it was filed on that original European date. As with most things with IP and the law in general, there are strict kind of laws regarding the deadlines when you must do those filings. For example, in most places, you have 1 year from your original filing. So if you're coming into the United States, you have already filed, for example, a patent application in your home region, that starts the clock ticking, and then you have 1 year to then file your subsequent cases in the world, in for example, US or any other, like I said, really industrialized country, to make sure you get that benefit. If you don't get that benefit, it could be a major problem for you, because subsequent examination can use your own patents, your own IP against you. So it's very important to kind of keep that chain intact.
Great, thanks a lot. And if I'm coming to the U.S., how can I find out if the product I have is even eligible for a patent, or if someone already has a patent on my particular product or space in the U.S. territory? How can I find that out?
Yeah, it's a good question. So it's kind of two things to consider, right? So in the United States, there's two things that you need to have to get a patent covering your technology. One of them is novelty, it has to be new. And the other one is it can't be obvious, right? Somebody can't look at what you've done and think, oh, what would have been obvious for me to take what was done previously and change it a little bit to get what you've done. So based on those two criteria, it can be somewhat difficult to figure out, if you're going to be able to get a patent in the United States. Novelty is somewhat easier, right? You can look, you can do some searching. The United States Patent and Trademark Office has tools you can use to search available patents. To determine patentability, though, it's not just patents, it's really anything that's published, that's out there, that is accessible by the public. So it is patents, published applications, any other publication that can be out there. So generally we, would do just general searching on the internet to see what's out there, publications, use, like I said, the tools the Patent Office provides. There's Google Patents, there's other tools that can be used. And so, like I said, the novelty piece, sometimes you can more easily figure out, because does it match up one-to-one with what you've done? That next step, the obviousness, is somewhat more difficult to put your finger on. And it can be a somewhat difficult analysis to perform. But that being said, it is somewhat important to do that searching, right? You don't want to spend a ton of money. You don't want to, go through this whole process, which can be long and expensive, come to find out that somebody's really done what you've done already, and now you've wasted all that money up front. I think it's important, David, to also note, though, there are really two questions when you're coming into the United States, right? There's the patentability piece. Can I get a patent on what I'm doing and what the invention that I've created? And that's certainly important, because the patent gives you a right to stop others from doing what you end up getting a patent on. But there's also a second question about a freedom. It's called freedom to operate. And oftentimes, unfortunately, those things are commingled, and they really should be viewed at separately. So, patentability, can I get a patent? And then freedom to operate is, can I actually do what I want in the United States? And it's really a separate question, right? And I can give an example to highlight the point. So I invent a new cup, right? A new cup, and it has a circular top, and the circular top is new. And I want to file a patent for this cup that has a circular top. I file my application. The examiner is going to look and see, has anybody else done anything out there or published anything out there? Doesn't have to be a patent, like I said. It can just be a journal article. It can be a educational publication. Has anybody else done this? Is it novel? Is it obvious? If the answer to both of those is, if it's novel, yes. Is it obvious? No. If you pass that test, you can get a patent. Does that automatically give you the right to sell your cup with the round opening? And the answer is no, right? That patent gives you the right to stop somebody else from selling a cup with a round opening. The question for whether you can sell your cup with a round opening is, does anybody else have patents, valid patents, that claim the specific cup that you're trying to sell, regardless of whether it has the round opening or not? Somebody else might have the patent that covers a different portion of your cup. And now you have a problem. You sell your cup and now you're infringing somebody else's patent. So these are really two separate questions that people should be thinking about as you come into the US market, because just because you get a patent doesn't mean you can actually sell the product that you want to sell or offer the service you want to provide. And
Dave, let me ask you this, because
Yeah.
I want to take a couple of questions. So I think one thing that trips people up on a related topic is around trademarking, right? So I think this
Yeah.
concept of use in the US is pretty different. Can you touch on that quickly?
Yeah, of course. So one unique aspect in the US, and different than a lot of other regions, is that in the US, you don't actually have to be using your trademark currently to file your application. So you file an application to your trademark, meaning when trademarks, we're not covering technology, right? We're covering the brand name attached to a good or service. And when you file your application, trademark application, you can say, well, I'm actually using this now. And here's my example, what they call a specimen. Here, I'm actually using it now in relation to these goods or services. The application will proceed, be examined. The examiner will come back and say, well, I think you're okay, or I think it's too close to this other registration. Can you change it a little bit?
But
And
that effectively prevents people from sitting on a mark, right? You can't just like, hey,
Right.
I'm going to go to the US one time, but I'm going to go ahead and trademark my brand. You have to actually be in use in country. Is that concept?
Exactly. So you can't squat on it, right? You can't just try to file a bunch of applications and then you hold the space. Unfortunately, people can't come in, right? So yeah, if you're actually using, it proceeds to grant. There's also what's called an intent to use application. An intent to use, you kind of start that whole process. You say, I'm going to use this. Let's get it examined. Let's get, approved. But then you never cross that finish line until you're able to show actual use. So it's a good place to start. I mean, I think with all IP, it's very important to think about early on in the process because of those hard deadlines. Patents, obviously, we mentioned you have those bar dates that come up. Trademarks, similarly, you want to be first to file. You want to get your rights squared away. But remember, you're going to have to eventually submit those examples of use or specimens of use in the goods and services that you lay out. Otherwise, you won't be able to get a registration.
Thanks, Dave. That's super helpful. I know we're coming up on the top of the hour. We'll have to try and get to a few questions. We have looks like quite a few in the chat. So I don't think we'll be able to get to all of them, but let me take a swing and see if we can get to something. Trying to come up with one. Heidi, there was a question that came in earlier from Jan Buis, assuming a Dutch existing company.
One second.
I answered that. It's difficult for me to advise because it's hard to, just on those facts, I can't really determine which will be the appropriate visa.
Okay.
Yeah, I have a general question for David. You
Yes,
said
please.
earlier that if I apply for a patent, so after a year it could go against me. I didn't understand. Could you please explain?
Yes, sure. So if you file your first application in your home country, you have 1 year. If you're going to come into the US, for example, and you want to file your next application in the United States, you have 1 year to file that. If you that links that second US application back to your original. So it's basically connected. If that's the case, when the examiner's looking at your US case, they can't go back to your original and use it against you. If you don't file within that 1 year, there's not that link. There's not the link between your US application and your original. And when that happens, an examiner can use your original against you because there's not the link. So the examiner can cite that original case against you as prior art. So it's very important to keep those links. And that's why the timing is very important to meet. Otherwise, you could defeat your own application. Does that make sense?
Yes, so you mean when I come to the US, I have to apply again for the patent?
Correct. Yeah. So there's your home country registrations or patents won't help you in the United States. You have to file in each country or region that you want to be in, right? So we often say it's best to file applications where you're operating, where your customers are, and where your competitors are. And so as you're thinking about that and you're expanding out, your home country within that year can provide a basis for further filings, but in and of itself is not going to provide you protection, for example, in the United States or anywhere else when you're expanding.
Thanks.
Yep.
And David Rose, there's one question that came in a little earlier asking if having an office in the US is mandatory to expect having offers from investors.
There's no hard and fast rules on that. So I think the short answer is no, that you wouldn't have to have an office to raise venture capital. In the US, there's a lot of venture capital firms who are very comfortable investing with companies in a different territory, but it depends greatly by firm. So it would not be a requirement. Ultimately, what the venture capital partners are interested in is a direct relationship with the CEO. So one question we get is, hey, do we need to move our company to the US to raise venture capital? And the way I answer that is only if the CEO is coming. Because if you just move your paperwork to the US and say this is where our headquarters is, but your CEO is still in Norway, that's really not what the VCs are after. So there are firms who are very comfortable doing it overseas, but it's going to vary, Aaron. There's not a hard answer on that.
From an immigration point of view, though, as I said before, if you don't have a physical office, it's very, very difficult for a new business to get a visa for the first executive or manager.
Yeah, good point. What other questions? We have just a couple more minutes before we wrap up.
I see one that just came into the chat. How to apply for a bank account for a Delaware company?
Yeah, great question. So for the banking standpoint, it depends on the bank. And so there are, like the large banks in the US are kind of stingy about how they do their know your customer or KYC rules. And so it's fairly difficult. There are regional banks that are much more friendly to doing business with foreign companies. And you don't actually even have to come to the US to open the account. You can do it remotely. You're going to provide, again, to open a US account, you're going to have the articles of incorporation and your FAIN number and a physical address. But you could just submit. I have a bank partner I work with, and all you have to do is submit your passport and proof of ID and proof of person for the officer, and they'll open the account for you. So you wouldn't actually have to have a social security number to do that. With certain banks, some you do. So it's, again, not a black and white answer all the way around, unfortunately. And the other question is around the 401k. So yeah, you'll need to have a 401k provided through the company itself. It's not super expensive to set that up. And there's lots of providers to do that. But again, the question becomes where it gets expensive is you can have the program itself and be administered, but the question becomes how much of a match will the company be willing to add on top of what the employees make? And that's where some important decisions come and where costs are incurred. There's a question around, so this are these procedures the same for a representative office? And do you mean like through a distributor? Is that the question?
Maybe like in the immigration world, when they say representative office, they mean not a separate like legal entity, but like a branch office that's a foreign representative office in the US. Maybe that's what they mean. But you still need a business registration to do business in wherever you're setting up this branch office, the state, and you will still need a federal employer ID number to operate any type of office, whether it's representative, branch office, or subsidiary. Yeah. Is from an immigration point of view.
Right. Well, thanks so much. We're coming up on the top of the hour. Again, thanks to everyone for joining us. Anthony Diaz from Select USA, who's been our gracious host today, was going to come on and say a quick word here at the close.
Oh yeah, sure. And actually, I should offer the graciousness to you all. Thank you so much, David Rose, Heidi Sung, and Dave Rocchio for joining us today. This session could be a summit on its own. So just really appreciate your time. Folks that are joining in, thank you so much. I know this session is being recorded, so please feel free to reach out to SUSE Events at trade.gov to reach out for the recording. I have to do a plug. So next year, June 23 to the 26th is our Select USA Investment Summit. It's our 10th summit. It's the biggest event for investment attraction in the United States. If you want to meet all the states and territories in one place, save on some time and meet great folks and do business in the United States, it's the place to be. Our website and registration will launch soon. And if you just want timely information, please feel free to sign to our newsletter. And you can get more information about Select USA and then the summit launch. So again, to our speakers, thank you. To our attendees, thank you so much. And I hope you all have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.